To understand a civilization, you don't begin with its monuments or its kings or even its victories. You begin with what it tried to hide its waste. The discarded, the flushed, the rotting matter of daily life. What was buried in silence often outlives what was written in stone. Every civilization produced it. And every civilization had to decide what to do with it. Waste is a constant. It has followed humanity from the beginning, more faithful than any religion, more consistent than any tradition. If you want to understand how people truly lived, not how they said they lived, not how they wished to be remembered, but how they existed in flesh and senthin, you must begin with what they left behind. The smell tells a story, one more honest than any monument, because it cannot be carved, cannot be edited, cannot be polished. It lingers. It whispers of meals consumed, bodies aging, habits formed, and taboos quietly broken. As long as there have been humans, there have been places to go. Even if they weren't called toilets, they were still spaces designed or chosen for that basic, inescapable act. In the earliest human settlements, when our ancestors first gathered around fires and formed families beneath shelters made of bone and hide, there was no plumbing, no ceramic bowls, no fragrant sprays to seal the shame. There was only need, and need gave birth to routine. You went away from the fire, away from the others, and you squatted behind a rock, beneath a tree, wherever the smell wouldn't linger too close to where you ate or slept. But when the group didn't move, when they settled in one place, planting crops and raising walls, the problem of permanence arrived. Waste stayed. It didn't drift away on the wind or dry in the sun. It accumulated. And suddenly, a daily act became a danger. The smell was the first alarm. It warned of flies, of illness, of predators drawn to rot. And so the earliest toilet was a pit, dug shallow into the earth, hidden just far enough to be ignored, but close enough to be reached. Leaves were used to wipe. Ash was scattered to cover. The stink was muffled, but never erased. These early latrines weren't built as engineering feats. They were dug with survival in mind, a barrier against infection, a barrier against shame. They were also social thresholds. In some cultures, who used the toilet first and who cleaned it revealed hierarchies. Children learned the rules young. Go here, not there. Don't speak while doing it. Cover your mess. Burn the cloth if it smells too strong. The rules weren't always written, but they were remembered passed from mother to daughter, elder to child, whispered like sacred warnings. The toilet was never just a hole. It was a space of transformation, where the private became public, where the sacred turned into soil, where the body proved that it couldn't keep everything it consumed. Waste was proof of life, but also of limits. And so, people gave their waste names, metaphors, euphemisms. They created gods to watch over toilets, demons that haunted latrines. They built their belief systems around managing that which disgusted them the most. Even in the earliest settlements, you can find charms buried beside toilet pits, stones shaped into animals, small offerings of food or feathers, anything to soften the fear. Because what if something followed you out of the toilet? What if the smell clung to your soul? In some regions, the placement of the toilet mattered more than the construction. It had to face away from the wind. It had to be built near running water or far from it, depending on the belief. If it was too close to the home, the spirits might be offended. If it was too far, danger might strike in the night. So toilets became carefully positioned. Some families built screens of woven reeds. Others dug pits behind walls. Still others created shared spaces where a few neighbors used the same spot. But with sharing came judgment. Who left the mess? Who didn't cover it? Who stank the worst? The smell became a source of gossip, of shame. And in time of punishment, with time came structure. Villages became towns. Towns grew into cities. And with growth came more people and more waste. Suddenly, managing filth was no longer a private task. It was political. Leaders had to decide how far should toilets be from wells. Should we bury waste outside the walls or channel it through the streets? Public defecation became common in some places, banned in others. Some communities dug deep trenches at the edge of town, filled them with ash and sand, and used them for months. Others built outhouses, tiny wooden boxes perched above pits. Some even began lining those pits with stone or clay, realizing that moisture spread disease, and the stink carried sickness, the toilet became both a tool of survival and a source of anxiety. Every decision made about its design reflected deeper truths about the people who used it. Were they concerned with privacy, with dignity, with control, or simply with pushing the stink far enough away to forget about it? But the smell never stayed gone. It drifted back in on the wind, clung to clothing. It found its way into homes and temples, reminding people that their bodies were never entirely clean. And so they fought the smell with everything they had. Ash, herbs, dried moss, incense, charcoal. They burned fragrant plants outside toilet doors. They carried perfumes in small jars. They even blamed the gods. In some places, if a child grew sick, it was said the latrine spirit had been offended. If a crop failed, they blamed the village dump. But even in fear, they continued to build deeper pits, stronger walls, better covers. It's always trying, generation after generation, to conquer the stink of being human. And yet the toilet always won, because every day, every body without fail had to sit and release. No matter how rich, no matter how royal, the smell would rise again. In the cradle of civilization between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, something extraordinary happened. People didn't just gather, they built. They designed cities, they wrote laws, they mapped the stars and measured the floodwaters. But beneath their temples, their palaces, their carefully irrigated fields, another revolution quietly unfolded. The management of human waste. In ancient Mesopotamia, the toilet became more than a pit. It became infrastructure. It became a statement of status, technology, and religious obligation. And just as they tracked lunar calendars and celestial alignments, the Mesopotamians also tracked the flow of filth. Because in a land where water was both sacred and dangerous, the handling of human waste was a sacred duty. And the smell-it was an enemy that had to be managed, contained, exercised. In the city of Yore, where kings once walked beneath ziggurats and cuneiform tablets, recorded the debts of merchants. Archaeologists have uncovered toilets. Real toilets, not mere ditches, but rooms with clay pipes, stone seating platforms, even rudimentary drainage systems. Some houses had vertical shafts carved into their floors, lined with baked brick and sealed with bitumen. Waste would drop down these shafts into cesspits or open drains that carried it away from the home. It wasn't a sewer system in the modern sense, but it was undeniably a system. Someone designed it. Someone maintained it. Someone cleaned it out. Because even with clever engineering, the stink didn't vanish on its own. The smell of ancient Mesopotamian cities was layered. Open gutters ran beside the streets. Chamber pots were emptied into courtyards. Waste was washed into canals, into ditches, into the same river used for bathing, for drinking, for ritual. And yet, people still fought the odor. Homes had separate rooms for latrines, often near the back, where water could be poured afterward to wash the area clean. And sand were sprinkled on the floors. Perfumed oils were kept nearby, made but to press against one's nose. When the scent became too sharp, incense was burned. Amulets were placed at toilet entrances. Everything in the architecture whispered that the toilet was both necessary and dangerous. A place of impurity, yes, but also of profound daily power. In Mesopotamian religion, cleanliness was not just physically, it was cosmic. Priests performed ablutions before entering temples. Ritual purity was required before sacrifices. And so, the handling of waste had to follow rules. There were designated areas for relieving oneself, specific times, even instructions for what to say while squatting. Some texts referenced demons that could attack through the anus if one was unprotected or careless. Toilets were sites of vulnerability, but also control. You could be made impure by your own body, but if you managed the process correctly, if you've cleaned yourself. If you offered the proper words, you could step back into society untainted. Smell wasn't just an annoyance. It was a signal, a warning that you had not yet crossed the boundary back into the clean world. And yet, for all their religious concern, the Mesopotamians were practical. Waste was everywhere in cities like Babylon, Nippur, and Lagash. The streets were dusty. The canals were brown. The air, especially in summer, thick with the smell of rot, of urine, of dung from both humans and animals. Night soil workers, named in most texts, but hinted at, must have hauled waste in jars, scraped it from alleys, buried it beyond the city walls. They likely smelled worse than anything else in town. And yet they were vital, because when a city reaches tens of thousands of people, waste is no longer just a personal issue, it becomes urban infrastructure. If left unchecked, it sickens the water, poisons the crops, and brings down the gods' wrath. The smell was the first symptom. A foul wind rising through a courtyard. A sour temps in the canal water. A housewife covering her mouth as she steps outside. And when the smell didn't tea leave, when it clung to walls and to clothing when fear set in. Toilets in the Mesopotamian world were also markers of class. A wealthy home might have a private latrine with a built-in drain, access to stored water for rinsing, and a servant tasked with cleaning. A poor laborer might squat behind the house, over a pit or nothing at all. Chamber pots were common, but they had to be emptied. That task was rarely given to the head of the household. Children, slaves, low-status workers bore the burden.
Ow.
The smell marked you. If you carried it on your clothes, if it rose from your skin, others would look away. Sometimes not because of disgust, but because of what the smell meant. That you were close to death, to danger, that you worked in the shadows of the city's most necessary structures. But there were moments, Sivan, in Mesopotamia, when toilets brought comfort. A breeze through the drainage shaft, cool clay underfoot, relief, however temporary, from the pressure inside the body. The moment of squatting, of letting go, of silence. And perhaps in that moment, a person might forget the heat, the flies, the constant need to manage what could never be fully managed. For a breath, they sat in a room built to handle the part of life no one wanted to talk about, but everyone lived with. The room of filth, the room of truth, and the smell was still there. Always. But the people of Mesopotamia learned more than most how to manage it, how to channel it, how to contain it without forgetting it, because to forget would be death. Toilet reminded them daily they were human, and humans always leave something behind. In the land of the Nile, where pyramids rose from the desert and the sun poured gold over stone and sand, the ancient Egyptians developed not only monumental architecture and divine kingship, but also systems for managing the human body. In a civilization that prized balance, order, and cleanliness, the toilet became a vital, if hidden, piece of daily ritual. Cleanliness was not just a matter of comfort, it was a spiritual command. The body was a temple, a vessel for the Ka, and even what it released had to be managed with precision. And so, in the shadows of temples, behind thick mud brick walls, and beneath homes of nobles and scribes, the lavatory evolved, not grand, not exalted, but essential. And the smell, it was something to be controlled, transformed, masked, and if possible erased. Ancient Egyptian homes, particularly those of the upper class, often had small rooms dedicated to toileting. These rooms were not ornate, but they were deliberate. Some had limestone seats rounded, smooth, set atop containers or shafts lined with sand and ash. Waste would be collected in jars or pits, sometimes buried or thrown into the fields as fertilizer. Poorer Egyptians squatted in the open, near the outskirts of town, using shared pits or corners shielded by woven mats. But regardless of wealth, the process was shaped by ritual and habit. After defecation, people used sand, shards of pottery, or even water poured from a vessel for cleaning. Ashes were sometimes scattered over waste to dull the odor. And incense, always nearby, was burned, not only for spiritual purity, but also to drive away flies and suppress the ever-lingering smell. The Egyptians had a strong concept of purity, both physical and spiritual. Priests were required to bathe multiple times a day. Women washed before rituals of fertility or childbirth. The smell of human waste violated this sense of cosmic order, known as mat. To allow it to linger was not just unpleasant, it was offensive to the gods. This is why even in the presence of death, Egyptians embalmed with spices, perfumes, and oils. The idea of putrefaction was closely tied to moral disorder. A foul-smelling latrine was not just a health hazard, it was a spiritual one, signaled rot, decay, a slipping away from divine harmony. And so, Even the act of relieving oneself required respect, cleaning afterward, disposing of waste properly, and restoring the air around the body to balance. But no system is perfect, and in the densely packed homes of the working class, the smell was difficult to escape. Cities like Thebes and Memphis grew tightly. Courtyards were shared. Waste sometimes accumulated in alleys or was dumped into the Nile. Chamber pots overflowed. In the heat of midday, the stink rose from drains and baskets and compost heaps. And yet people adapted. They spread sand infused with myrrh or crushed lotus petals across their floors. They hung scented garlands at doorways. They smeared perfumed oils on their necks and wrists. The Egyptian obsession with fragrance was not merely vanity, it was survival. It was psychological armor against the daily presence of rot and decay. Even in their writings, the Egyptians revealed the presence of toilets, instructions for cleanliness, warnings about bad air. The famous medical papyri describe digestive ailments, prescribe laxatives, and include hygiene treatments involving honey, milk, and oil. Excrement was understood as both necessary and dangerous. In magical texts, waste could be used in curses or healing, depending on intention. The smell itself could be a weapon carried on wind, used to drive out evil or to shame an enemy. And for the living, it was always there, in the sand, in the sweat, in the undercurrent of every meal, every prayer, every dream. The tombs of the elite, however, attempted to transcend all that. They were filled with images of pristine gardens, pools of blue water, servants bringing bread and figs, not of the waste that followed life. But the mummies inside had once used lavatories. They had once crouched over jars. They had once wrinkled their noses. The absence of toilets in the afterlife was deliberate. To be freed from the body's needs was to be divine. To escape the stink was to join the gods. Still, the archaeologist finds them. The stone seats, the waste jars, the layers of ash and dried human residue in sunken pits. And the evidence tells us that even under the painted ceilings of Pharaoh's tombs, humanity was never far from its own smell. What the Egyptians tried to erase, the earth preserved. And so we know, they too lived with it, managed it, feared it, fought it, sometimes tried to perfume it into something beautiful. Because to live in balance with waste was to honor the body. And to mask its odor with myrrh, incense, and sacred sand was not to deny it, but to turn the stink of living into something just barely divine. In ancient Greece, the body was a subject of art, philosophy, and public life. Sculpted in marble, studied in gymnasiums, celebrated in the Olympic Games, every sinew and motion of flesh was admired. But even in a world that idolized form and mind, the realities of digestion could not be ignored. The philosophers who debated virtue also had to relieve themselves. The poets who praised love also squatted over clay pots. Behind the columns and beneath the open skies, the Greeks developed a practical and sometimes surprisingly public relationship with waste. And while they didn't build the sewer systems of later empires, they laid the cultural groundwork for something just as profound, a communal, even social, understanding of the toilet. In most Greek homes, toilets were not elaborate. Chamber pots called scaramoughs were used in bedrooms or kitchens, tucked beneath beds or chairs. Made of clay, some with wide mouths, some with handles, they were often unadorned. After use, their contents would be emptied either into a backyard pit, a gutter along the street, or into the nearest alley. In wealthier homes, a servant might carry the pot discreetly and wash it afterward with water and ash. In poorer districts, the smell told you everything. Who had emptied their pot? Who hadn't? Which corner to avoid? Which breeze to fear? Streets were not silent, nor were they clean. And the scent of a neighbor's waste could drift through an open window like an unwanted guest. But the Greeks didn't always hide their waste. Public latrines existed in some cities' modest structures of stone or wood, often located near the agora or bathhouses. They were simple, often shared by many, with stone benches carved with holes and drainage channels beneath. Users sat side by side, with no partitions. Conversation was not uncommon. The toilet became a site of gossip, jokes, and philosophy. Just as the symposium was for wine and ideas, the latrine was for laughter, relief, and observation. The body was not shameful in itself, but smell was another matter. While nudity and function could be accepted, stench was an enemy. So Greeks carried scented oils, burned resins, washed themselves after every toilet visit if possible. The act was common, but the odor was always something to push away. Greek writings even referenced toilets, indirectly and directly. Aristophanes filled his comedies with scatological jokes. Philosophers like Diogenes used toilet behavior to challenge societal norms, relieving himself in public to demonstrate contempt for convention. In medicine, Hippocrates and his followers closely observed stools to diagnose illness, linking color, texture, and smell to imbalances in the four humors. Excrement was a signal, a text the body wrote daily. Doctors learned to read it with both clinical detachment and urgent concern. They prescribed diets to soften stool, treatments to purge it, and rituals to keep it from lingering too long inside. Constipation was a threat not just to the gut but to the soul. Women in Greece, however, experienced the toilet differently. Often confined to the domestic space, they used chamber pots in private, sometimes with the help of attendants. They cleaned themselves with cloths, with water poured by hand, or with sponges. Men, on the other hand, had greater access to public spaces, and often relieved themselves wherever it was socially acceptable in alleys, behind stables, or beside the city wall. This gendered division reinforced power, access, and who carried the burden of managing the mess, and that mess never went away. Urban Athens, for all its beauty, was full of human and animal waste. It baked in the sun, collected in gutters. And yet the Greeks continued to celebrate order cosmos even in the face of filth. For the Greeks, order didn't mean sterility. It meant harmony between body, space, and habit. And so, while they didn't build underground sewers or wide-reaching drainage systems, they built habits that worked. Waste was used as fertilizer in fields. Ash mixed with urine made cleaning agents. Some households had private lavatories with clever designs, sloped floors, clay piping, openings that led to shallow pits outside the walls. It wasn't perfect, but it was thoughtful. And in their thoughtfulness, the Greeks laid a foundation for sanitation, not as technology, but as philosophy. The stink reminded them daily that the body was never separate from the mind. The control of waste was part of control of self, and that to live well was not to escape the toilet but to make peace with it. Even in death, the Greeks acknowledged the body's waste. Tomb inscriptions sometimes included instructions for cleanliness. Myths spoke of souls defiled by filth. Heroes were described not just by strength, but by control over appetites and impulses, including the most basic. The ideal citizen, like the ideal home, was clean, not only in word but in smell. And so chamber pots were scrubbed, latrines were swept, streets were washed with seawater when possible. Not because the Greeks believed they could conquer the stink entirely, but because they believed civilization required the effort. The chamber pot, humble and often hidden, was as Greek as the lyre or the column, and in that clay bowl, passed hand to hand, rinsed in cold water. Carried out at dawn lay the proof that even a culture of beauty and logic had to bow to the reality of waste. The Romans built an empire of stone and order. Roads stretched across continents. Aqueducts carried water to cities. Laws governed markets and marriages. And beneath the marble forums and bustling amphitheaters, an entire civilization quietly flowed with filth. For all their triumphs, the Romans understood something fundamental. To manage a city, you had to manage its waste. Not just the political waste of corruption or the battlefield's aftermath, but the daily, human, biological waste produced by every citizen, slave, soldier, and senator. The toilet in Rome was not an afterthought. It was architecture. It was strategy. It was a necessity that became an art form, their answer to the eternal stink of life. Water, moving water, flushing, redirecting, sweeping away the evidence of existence. Roman cities were marvels of public engineering, and one of their proudest achievements was the complex system of sewers. The Cloaca Maxima in Rome, one of the oldest and most enduring examples, wasn't just a drain, it was a philosophy. A declaration that filth had to move, that smell had to go. The city, to breathe and grow, had to be cleaned from below. Wastewater from homes, baths, and latrines flowed into underground channels, joining rain and runoff, all moving downward toward the Tiber. It wasn't perfect. Stench still rose from the drains. During dry seasons, the flow slowed. During floods, it reversed. But the intent was clear. Rome would not sit in its own filth. It would build channels to carry it away. In public latrines, the Roman genius for shared experience reached its most practical form. These toilets, often located near forums, markets, or bathhouses, were open to all citizens. Inside, rows of stone or marble seats lined the walls, each with a central hole and a secondary slot for cleaning tools. There were no walls, no partitions. People sat side by side doing their business while discussing politics, gossip, or gladiator matches. Below the seats ran channels of water that carried the waste into the sewers. In front of the seats flowed another channel with fresh water for rinsing a sponge attached to a stick, called a tersorium. After wiping, the sponge was dipped, squeezed, and left for the next user. It was communal. It was efficient. Privacy was not always a priority. Efficiency was. The bathhouse culture of Rome had already taught people to socialize in nakedness, to share hot pools and cold plunges to be seen. The latrine was just another extension of public life. The design of these spaces reflected Roman values: durability, cleanliness through movement, and civic cooperation. And yet, for all their innovation, the problem of smell remained. The sewers worked best when water flowed constantly, but in drier months, stagnation brought odor. Gases rose from the drains. Latrine attendant slaves or hired workers threw lime, ash, and aromatic herbs into the channels. They scrubbed, they rinsed. They tried daily to chase the stink from a system built to move filth, but not always fast enough. Romans were not immune to the psychological weight of their own waste. Writers and poets referenced it. Martial made jokes about foul-smelling neighborhoods. Pliny the Elder noted the dangers of sewer gases, even suggesting they could be fatal if inhaled. And some Romans held superstitions about toilets fearing spirits that lurked in the drains, or demons that rose with the smell. In homes, chamber pots were common, especially in upper floors. These would be emptied into the street below, often with a warning shout. Laws were passed banning careless dumping, but enforcement was spotty. Streets, especially in crowded districts, often ran with a mixture of waste and water. The city had sewers, yes, but not every citizen used them as intended. Even in villas and palaces, the management of waste revealed class and priority. Wealthy homes sometimes had private latrines with tiled floors and access to flowing water. Some were beautifully decorated, with mosaics on the walls, painted ceilings, and even built-in ventilation. These were spaces of dignity, even while doing something undignified. The poor, in contrast, might share a single latrine between many families, or resort to the riverbank, the edge of a garden, or a dark alley. And yet, regardless of class, everyone needed to go. The empire's grandeur began at the forum, but its truth lived in the sewer. Our bosses played a special role in the Roman hygiene system. After defecating, many citizens visited the baths, not only to cleanse the body, but to purify the mind. The baths were where dirt, sweat, and scent were washed away in a ritual of scrubbing, scraping, soaking, and socializing. The connection between the toilet and the bath was not just physical, light was cultural. Cleanliness was an identity. Good Roman was not only rational and brave, but also clean. Smell was a sign of disorder, threat to dignity, something to be erased, even if it never fully disappeared. Roman engineers even experimented with toilet innovation. Some latrines had curved channels to increase water flow. Some had covers to keep out rats and rising gases. They used gravity, slope, and stone to shape the movement of waste. And while no system was perfect, their ambition was unmatched. They weren't just building for convenience. They were building to control nature, to tame the stink of life. And for centuries, it worked well enough to support cities of unimaginable size and density. But in the end, even Rome couldn't flush away the truth. The sewer needed constant maintenance. The drains needed water. And the stink, persistent, bold, immune to design, remained, rising from the stones, whispering beneath the marble, clinging to the corners of the greatest city the ancient world ever knew. The Romans mastered many things: law, language, architecture, but their greatest, least celebrated legacy may be this: They tried to build a world where waste could flow away quietly, leaving dignity behind. In the ancient cultures of the Far East spanning dynasties, mountains and river valleys, the toilet was never just a place to discard waste. It was a reflection of harmony, of ritual, aesthetics. In China, in Korea, in Japan, the act of relieving oneself was interwoven with ideas of health, balance, privacy, and even poetry. The smells, though real and undeniable, were managed not only through architecture or materials, but through philosophy. Cleanliness wasn't just physical-eyed, was moral, emotional, spiritual. A bad odor disrupted more than the nose. It disrupted the flow of qi. It clashed with nature. And so, the toilets of the Far East evolved into some of the most thoughtful and quietly beautiful solutions to humanity's oldest problem. In ancient China, particularly during the Han and Tang dynasties, toilets ranged from crude to sophisticated. In rural areas, people still used open pits, often surrounded by bamboo screens or mud brick walls, with straw or ash scattered to dull the smell. But in more developed homes, especially in urban centers and noble estates, latrines were carefully built, seated, ventilated, often constructed over flowing water or cesspits that were cleaned regularly. Some used animal manure and human waste together, creating compost for fields. These night soil systems were practical, and cyclic waste became fertilizer, which fed crops, which fed people, who then created more waste. But despite the system's brilliance, the smell remained a challenge, so they masked it with tradition. Toilets were built downwind. Fragrant woods were used in construction. And incense always played a central role. The Confucian worldview emphasized respect for the body, for the family, for order. And even the toilet was part of that framework. Guests were spared the sight or smell of waste areas. Children were taught early not just how to go, but how to clean up, where to empty pots, and what not to say. Silence surrounded the act. But that silence was not ignorance. Manuals existed. Instructions passed down through generations. Whole texts discussed hygiene, diet, and digestion. Doctors steeped in traditional Chinese medicine read feces like signs in tea leaves. The color, shape, frequency, and especially the smell were clues to inner imbalance. A foul odor might mean heat in the liver. A pale stool might suggest spleen deficiency. The toilet, in essence, became a diagnostic tool, a private clinic beneath the home. Meanwhile, in Japan, the toilet was a space of ritual and contradiction. In Shinto belief, cleanliness is sacred. Impurity known as kagari must be removed before entering a shrine or performing a rite. Waste was part of that impurity, and so toilets were treated with reverence and caution. They were often built separate from the main house or connected by a small walkway to keep the smell away from living areas. But they were also cleaned relentlessly, with straw, water, vinegar, sometimes even sake. The smell, when it appeared, was met not with resignation, but with ceremony. Some families placed protective charms near the latrine. Others offered daily prayers to kin the god of the hearth and the toilet. In this belief system, the deity dwelled in fire and waste alike. You could offend him with disrespect, or honor him by keeping the place clean. The architecture of Japanese toilets was elegant in its simplicity. Wooden floors, holes aligned over pits, some with sloped ceramic tiles to ease cleaning. In wealthier homes, seats were carved from smooth hinoki cypress, known for its subtle fragrance and antimicrobial properties in wiping. Not with harsh cloths, but with folded paper, water, or fresh leaves. Everything had its season. In summer, fans blew the air out. In winter, ash warmed the floor. The space was always in dialogue with the world outside. And the smell, though never fully gone, was shaped, lessened, redirected, absorbed until it became more whisper than warning. Korea, too, had its traditions. Under the influence of both Confucian and Buddhist thought, cleanliness was deeply respected. In the countryside, people often used dry, toilet-raised platforms with collection pots below. These pots were emptied regularly into compost heaps. Night soil collectors traveled from home to home, gathering waste to be sold as fertilizer. It was a livelihood, Humble but vital, smell clung to them as did the stigma. But their work fed rice fields, vegetable plots, and tea terraces. The economy moved not just with silver, but with stink. In noble homes, toilets were tucked behind the kitchen or down the garden path, placed where wind could carry the smell away from guests. And when paper became common, wiping became more refined. Soft mulberry fibers, leaves soaked in warm water. Even silk, on rare occasions, for the most delicate among the elite. Yet across all three cultures, something fascinating emerged, the connection between defecation and reflection. Poets wrote verses in or near latrines. Scholars scribbled ideas while squatting over pits. The act of letting go of emptying became metaphor. For release, for cleansing, for insight. Toilet spaces were not only physical zones, they were psychological thresholds. And the smell, though unpleasant, reminded the user of mortality, of the body's limits, of the cycles of digestion and decay. Even today, remnants of those traditions persist. In rural villages, composting toilets are still used. In cities, ultra-modern bidets and heated seats reflect centuries of innovation built on ancient thought. The smell, managed with air filters and sprays, is no longer dominant, but its memory shapes design. Silence remains part of the ritual. Cleanliness remains a moral act. In the Far East, toilets were never just about function. They were about form, emotion, energy. They were sculpted to fit with the seasons, designed to face the wind, aligned with the sun. The smell of waste was understood, not just avoided, by listening to that smell, shaping it, masking it with incense and silk. The people of the Far East turned the toilet into something astonishingly rare in human history, a space of beauty. In the vast and ancient land of India, where spirituality pulses through rivers, stones and syllables, the management of waste was never a simple matter of necessity. It was and still is a question of purity, of karma, of caste. In no other culture has the act of relieving the body been so intertwined with the soulless journey. The toilet in India was not just a pit or a pot, it was a moral space, a site of fear and cleansing, a boundary between the sacred and the profane. And in every village, temple, and palace, the smell of waste lingered not just in the air, but in the stories, rituals, and unspoken hierarchies that shaped daily life. For millennia, Indian civilization flourished along rivers, especially the Indus and Ganges. And from the earliest days of the Harappan cities like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, sanitation was not only understood but engineered. These cities had brick-lined drains running beneath the streets. Homes were often equipped with small bathing areas and rudimentary toilets connected to covered drains. Some structures even had vertical chutes for waste disposal. Water flowed, guided by gravity, sweeping human refuse into shared channels and away from living quarters. While archaeologists still debate the full extent of this system's complexity, one thing is certain: the people of the Indus Valley didn't simply live with their waste. They moved it, hid it, controlled it, but they could never fully escape the scent it left behind. In Vedic and later Hindu society, the relationship to waste became deeply ritualized. Bodily excretions, urine, feces, sweat, even nail clippings were considered impure. Touching them, even being near them, could pollute a person spiritually, so toilets were always placed far from the home's center, often in a detached structure, behind the kitchen or across the courtyard. In rural areas, people went into fields, always with a small pot of water, ever papered to wash themselves afterward. The act of cleansing was essential. Water didn't just clean the skin, it washed away sin. It reset spiritual balance. That cleansing could not be rushed or ignored. One had to squat, relieve, rinse, and only then re-enter the home, often with fresh clothes and clean feet. Yet the smell of waste remained an ever-present force, especially in crowded cities or temples visited by thousands daily. The scent of humanity's needs drifted between incense and flower garlands. To counter it, people burned dried cow dung, which gave off a distinct but earthy aroma: camphor, ghee, sandalwood. These were not just sacred substances, they were olfactory armor. But for those who worked with waste directly, no perfume could disguise their labor. Across generations, Dalits once labeled untouchables were assigned the task of cleaning latrines, removing night soil, sweeping streets. They carried buckets of human waste on their heads, dumped them far from towns, and returned to clean again. The smell marked them. It shaped their destiny. It followed them into dreams and marriage prospects. It was more than scent. It was stigma. But the picture is more complex than mere division. Ancient Ayurvedic texts devoted entire sections to digestion, excretion, and cleanliness. Stool was studied, not ignored. Physicians read it to diagnose doshic, imbalances vata, pitta, kapha. A sharp odor could mean excess fire in the system. A foul, sticky texture might signal dietary sign. Waste, though impure, was informative. It was the body's report card, so toilets were designed not only to separate the impure from the pure but to teach, to observe, to correct. Even sacred texts did not shy away. The Manusmriti and other Dharmashastras laid out precise rules for defecation. The direction one should face, the time of day, the distance from water sources, and the postures that preserve dignity and health. Rituals accompanied the act. Some whispered mantras. Others poured water in spirals. And always there was a returner rejoining of the clean world through washing, silence, and sometimes prayer. Yet despite the rules, the odor of life could not be fully hidden. Festivals brought thousands together. Pilgrims walked for weeks, relieving themselves on temple outskirts, near rivers, behind trees. Ashrams managed communal latrines with great care, but the scent of shared digestion rose each morning with the sun. Cities like Varanasi, though sacred, carried the smell of thousands washing, eating, and emptying their bowels by the Ganges. The river was both purifying and polluted. A paradox. It's just like the Indian toilet. With time, technology changed. In medieval and colonial periods, brick latrines became common. Some homes had flush systems. Others used bucket toilets that servants had to clean. And still, the smell clung to caste, to duty, to fear. In modern times, campaigns like Swachh Bharat have aimed to change this legacy, to build toilets for all, to ban manual scavenging, to break the link between birth and burden. But the past lingers, in habits, in language, in the way people speak. Don't speak about the toilet. And yet there's something profound in the Indian approach. The toilet is not romanticized. It's not hidden in marble or gold. It's acknowledged, managed, feared, respected. The smell is part of life, something to be endured, not denied. It reminds each person, no matter how holy or humble, that the body is temporary, that purity is a process, that even the most sacred walk barefoot across the earth, stepping carefully between scent and silence. In the world of medieval Europe, where castles loomed above muddy villages and church bells marked the rhythm of life, the toilet was both a necessity and an afterthought. Stone walls were thick, towers high, halls echoing with song and scripture, but behind the tapestries and beyond the torchlight, the reality of human waste pressed in every day. The stink of the medieval world wasn't just outside the castle gates. It was in the kitchens, the bedrooms, the stairwells, the moats. It rose from chamber pots left too long unemptied. It flowed beneath floorboards. It seeped between cobblestones. Yet somehow people lived with it, managed it, shaped it into a system not of plumbing, but of social survival. Inside the stone walls of a castle, waste was rarely invisible. For nobles and servants alike, chamber pots were the standard. Made of wood, pewter, or ceramic, these portable toilets were kept under beds, near fireplaces, behind chairs. At night, especially in winter, no one wanted to descend narrow stairwells to reach an outdoor latrine. So chamber pots served everyone from knights to cooks to queens, but they had to be emptied. And that job almost never fell to the pot's user. Servants, often boys or lower status women, were tasked with carrying the pots outside, dumping them into cesspits, moats, or out of upper story windows into designated dumping areas. Sometimes the windows weren't so designated. And so, walking beneath castle walls could be hazardous not from arrows, but from falling filth. Larger castles included purpose-built latrines called garderobes. These were narrow stone or wooden enclosures built along the outer walls, cantilevered over a chute or shaft that led straight down, sometimes into the moat, sometimes onto the ground below. A wooden seat was placed over the hole, with a small window for air or light. In cold weather, the stone chilled the seat until it burned. In summer, the stench rose like steam. Servants periodically dropped straw or ash down the shafts to absorb the waste, but the smell never truly disappeared. It wafted up through cracks in the stone. It clung to cloaks. It drifted through hallways when the wind turned. Even kings smelled it. They might not clean the garderobe, but they couldn't ignore it. Moats often imagined as romantic rings of water defending great castles were frequently filled with more than rain. They collected waste from above, runoff from kitchens, refuse from animals, and human excrement flushed from latrines. Some moats stagnated in summer, breeding flies and disease. Others became open cesspools, bubbling with rot. The smell was intense, inescapable, sour with decomposition. And still, people built their bedrooms above them. They believed the moat's smell could deter enemies, or perhaps they simply accepted it as the price of safety. In medieval towns, sanitation was worse. Narrow alleys crammed with wooden houses, slaughterhouses beside bakeries, open ditches running between doorways. Chamber pots were emptied into the street, often with a cry, "Gardes l'eau," a warning in French to watch for falling water. But the water wasn't always liquid. In cities like Paris, London, and Prague, stepping outside meant stepping through filth. Shoes were thick, dresses were long, and the hem of a noblewoman's gown might carry the stink of 5 different households by midday. Public latrines existed, some in monasteries, some attached to inns or marketplaces, but they were few and poorly maintained. People relieved themselves in alleys, behind stables, near bridges, or beside churches. The smell was constant. It mingled with smoke from cook fires, the tang of iron, the sour of spoiled wine. But unlike modern cities, no one pretended the smell could be avoided. It was part of the landscape, a feature, not a flaw. Monasteries, however, often handled waste differently. With their focus on order and purity, many included Reindeer's communal latrines designed for silence and routine. Stone channels beneath rows of seats carried waste away, flushed by running water from diverted streams. Monks sat in quiet lines, following fixed schedules, maintaining cleanliness as a form of spiritual discipline. But even here, the smell remained. It seeped into cloisters, into libraries, to the cells of the sleeping. Cleanliness was often symbolic. Bathing was rare, sometimes discouraged as vanity or weakness. But spiritual purity could be achieved without soap or water. Pilgrims walked barefoot through filth to reach holy sites. Saints were praised for enduring disease, filth, and sores. To smell bad was sometimes seen as a sign of holiness, a rejection of earthly vanity. Some even believed that suffering the stench of others was a form of penance, a way to mirror the suffering of Christ. But behind the symbolism, the reality was grimmer. Waste carried disease, dysentery, cholera, plague, the Black Death, spread in part through the rats that lived in the filth of cities. And yet, people didn't always connect sickness with sanitation. They blamed sin, astrology. Foreigners, toilets were not redesigned, they were endured. Until the Renaissance, few innovations appeared. Same chamber pots, same moats, same smell. Still, some medieval thinkers observed, Tinkard wrote, manuals survived, describing how to build cesspits, how to place latrines downwind, how to use lime to combat odor, and castles. The garderobes were sometimes placed near kitchens, not for proximity, but because the heat helped dry the waste. The walls themselves absorbed the stink, and over centuries, those stones became dark with the smell of history. And yet people lived full lives in those castles. They feasted, married, sang, prayed, gave birth, died. The stink didn't stop them. It shaped them, taught them patience, made them resourceful, gave rise to rules unspoken and written about how to behave in the face of rot. Because in the end, even surrounded by banners and steel, the medieval world was never far from its own smell. In the icy reaches of the far north, where the sun vanishes for months and the land freezes harder than stone, the toilet posed a challenge far greater than discomfort. It was a battle against the elements. Among the Sami herders of Scandinavia, the reindeer-keeping Nenots of Siberia, the Inuit of Greenland, and other Arctic peoples, warmth was not a luxury. It was survival. Shelter had to be small, heat had to be trapped, and every movement beyond the hearth meant exposure to wind that sliced through bone. And yet, even here in the frozen twilight where the land creaked beneath snow and time seemed to stop, the body still moved, still digested, still needed to let go. And so, toilets evolved in strange, efficient, and deeply human ways. Their smell didn't always rise in the air it crystallized in the cold, but it lingered, not as stench, as presence, as memory, as warning. Among the Sami of northern Scandinavia, nomadic families moved with their herds across tundra and forest. Their dwellings, Lavu and Godi, were simple structures of wood, turf, and reindeer hide. In these low tents, heated by open fires, there was no room for waste to be hidden. Toilets were not inside. They were out in the snow. A trench dug beside a tree. A slope behind a rock. Sometimes a small makeshift outhouse with a seat carved from driftwood. But always the journey to relieve oneself was a brief ritual of cold endurance. People wrapped in furs, boots pulled tight, wind howling at their backs. They squatted in the dark, sometimes using snow to wipe, sometimes moss or smooth stones. And in winter, their waste froze within moments, turning foulness into sculpture. The smell at first didn't rise. But in spring, when the sun returned and the snow began to melt, it returned with vengeance. In the taiga and tundra of Siberia, the Nenets people lived with reindeer herds, moving across vast white plains where no trees grew and the horizon never ended. Their Chumston-like structures covered in reindeer hides were anchored with snow and bones. Waste was dealt with outside, pit dug deep into the permafrost. A windbreak fashioned from sleds. Men and women ventured out in layers of skin and wool, sometimes in total darkness, guided only by memory. They moved quickly, not only because of the cold, but because of the danger. Wolves, bears, spirits, the land itself. Children were taught early how to go without freezing, how to avoid frostbite, how to clean with snow without soaking through gloves. And again, the smell was buried under ice. Preserved, but never gone. In Greenland, the Inuit part of the broader Inuit family developed their own systems. In igloos and turf homes, there were no latrines in the modern sense. But containers often carved from stone or shaped from driftwood served as night pots. In some cases, blubber-filled lamps provided enough heat to prevent freezing. Waste was dumped outside, away from food caches and dog sleds. In larger settlements, communal middens formed heaps of frozen waste, layered year by year, and when the thaw came, it melted into the soil, into the air. The smell didn't dominate, but it haunted. In summer, mosquitoes bred near these sites, bears sniffed their way to ward camps, and the elders told stories of disease, of disrespect, of the consequences of leaving waste too close to camp. The smell wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. Wiping, too, was dictated by the climate. Paper was rare, so was cloth. Instead, snow was the default. Clean, abundant, numbing, a handful pressed gently. Moss, when dried and gathered in bundles, became a soft and absorbent alternative. In warmer seasons, broad leaves served, and everything was done with care, because in the north, mistakes could be fatal. Wet clothes meant frostbite. Exposure could mean death. The toilet was not a room, it was an expedition. And yet, for all the hardship, there was adaptation, a rhythm. Families developed routes to safe toilet spots, paths worn into the snow. Stones set to mark windbreaks. Dogs trained to avoid the area. Children carried small bags of ash or lichen to scatter afterward. The waste froze. The smell paused. Life continued. In more recent centuries, Arctic explorers and missionaries introduced European outhouses, wooden boxes with seats, sometimes with canvas or fur flaps. These froze quickly. Ice formed along the walls, and in some cases, they became more dangerous than useful. People slipped. The holes iced over. The smell, trapped inside, became sharp and sour ammonia, biting the nose as soon as the door swung open. Some communities abandoned them, returning to the simplicity of snow and wind. But the far north's greatest lesson was this: the body remains the same, no matter the cold. Digestion doesn't wait for sunrise. The need is universal. And so, even in lands of ice and darkness, people found ways to coexist with waste, to endure the stench when it thawed, to teach their children not to fear the smell, but to respect it, to listen to it. Because in the Arctic, waste could attract predators. It could spoil food. It could signal carelessness. And so it became something sacred, not in the sense of worship, but in the sense of survival. Today, many Arctic communities use modern plumbing where possible. Vacuum toilets, composting systems, tanks emptied by helicopters or snowmobiles. But in the most remote places, the snow toilet still reigns. The smell, when it appears, is brief, blown away by wind, buried by ice, but never forgotten. Because in the far north, even filth is shaped by the seasons, frozen, preserved, then reborn in spring. The future of toilets begins not with porcelain or pipes, but with pressure, physics, and the silent hum of machines orbiting above Earth. In the controlled ecosystems of space stations, in the dreams of Mars colonization, and in the sterile white labs of engineers and scientists, a question echoes louder than any launch countdown: how? Do you go to the bathroom when gravity is no longer there to help you? The toilet in space is no longer just a convenience. It is a science experiment, a hazard, a system that must work perfectly every time, or risk contaminating an entire ship. And as humanity looks toward other planets, toward moon bases, orbital hotels, and Martian habitats, the humble toilet rises again as a symbol of civilization's limits and of its astonishing ingenuity. On the International Space Station, toilets are masterpieces of mechanical compromise. They don't flush, they suction. They strap in. Waste doesn't fall. It floats unless caught by carefully designed airflow. Liquid and solid waste are separated immediately. Urine is vacuumed into a recycling system that converts it back into drinkable water. Feces is captured in individual bags, sealed and stored in containers that are eventually burned up on re-entry into Earth's atmosphere. It sounds clean, efficient, but the smell still exists. Despite air filtration, charcoal filters, and layers of containment, the scent of human waste in zero gravity has been described by astronauts as sharp, metallic, and persistent. There is no escaping it. It floats, lingers, becomes part of the air you breathe. Microgravity affects everything, including digestion. Gases don't rise. Solids don't settle. Flatulence becomes dangerous if not carefully vented. Constipation is common. Diarrhea is a nightmare. Every waste management system must account for every possibility, every accident, every drop of liquid. The smallest leak can float endlessly, stick to equipment, or find its way into vents and electronics. So toilets in space are treated with reverence. Training includes toilet use. Hours of it, practice runs, instructional videos. Every astronaut must know how to position, seal, and operate the vacuum hose with precision. One wrong move, and the consequences are more than unpleasant, they're hazardous. As space agencies prepare for long-duration missions, 6 months to Mars, then months on the surface, then 6 months home, the toilet becomes central to mission design. Water recycling becomes essential. Storage of solid waste must be odorless, weight-efficient, and safe. Engineers have proposed radiation-shielding toilets that store waste along the ship, as walls to protect astronauts from cosmic rays. Others imagine waste compacted into building bricks for shelters on Mars. Some designs even propose using feces as part of algae-based life support systems, turning excrement into food, oxygen, or fuel. In the future, nothing can be wasted, even waste. On Earth, the future is arriving too. Smart toilets are now in development units that analyze urine and stool for biomarkers, detect illness early, monitor hydration and blood sugar. These toilets offer real-time feedback to users. Some are connected to apps. Some use AI to learn your patterns. In Japan and South Korea, high-tech bidets with heated seats, drying fans, and deodorizing mists are already common. Public restrooms can self-clean, play music to mask sound, and release pleasant fragrances after every use. But even these marvels can't entirely erase the smell. Human waste, no matter how processed, still carries the trace of what it once was. In refugee camps, remote villages, and disaster zones, the future of toilets is also urgent. Composting toilets, solar-powered sanitation pods, and waterless vacuum toilets are being deployed to places where plumbing is impossible. Engineers design toilets for $2 for 100 people for no running water, because dignity and health depend on them. Even in the future, smell will be a challenge. Ventilation, microbial digestion, charcoal layers all must work in tandem because the scent of failure is unmistakable. And then there's Mars. Red, dry, thinnered, cold. There. Toilets must be closed, loop, zero contamination, nearly silent. It must work in low gravity inside pressurized habitats where air is limited and privacy is precious. The smell of one person's waste could fill an entire dome. So engineers test odor sealing bags, microbial neutralizers, and odor-absorbing polymers. Toilets are tested not just for suction, but for silence, for psychological comfort, for dignity in a world where there are no open windows. Perhaps the greatest shift in the future toilet is philosophical. No longer hidden in basements or tucked behind doors, toilets are becoming symbols of health data, recycling technology, even planetary survival. They are not just where we let go, but where we understand the body. They tell us what we've eaten, how we've lived, what's wrong, what's working. They are diagnostic chambers, environmental monitors, personal archives, and yet the smell remains. It may be filtered, analyzed, masked, or transformed, but it's there, a whisper from the gut. A reminder that no matter how far we travel, no matter how advanced our machines become, we still produce waste, still seek a place to put it, still build around it. And in that search, we are still always human. Even on Mars, the toilet will matter, and someone will still have to clean it. In the end, the story of toilets is the story of us. How we lived, how we built, how we coped, how we cleaned. It is a history not told in marble statues or royal bloodlines, but in ash pits and drain pipes, in chamber pots and compost, in bamboo screens and ceramic thrones. It smells foul, fleeting, and unforgettable. We began in the wild, relieving ourselves under open skies, far from the fire, watched only by the stars, and from there, we built walls. Dug pits, carved seats, carried pots. We learned to wipe, to wash, to rinse, to flush. We learned to live not just with each other, but with the things we'd rather forget. And in every age, from Sumer to Silicon Valley, the toilet evolved with us. It told us what we feared, what we valued, what we couldn't hide. Because no matter the culture, no matter the era, the same truth lingers. Everyone has to go. Pharaohs, gladiators, emperors, cowboys, cosmonauts. The stink reaches us all. And so, we tried to manage it, to mask it, to make it go away. But it never really did. It clung to city walls, to castle stairs, to temple courtyards and spaceship vents. It reminded us of mortality, of biology, of the inconvenient truth that civilization, for all its triumphs, is built on managing mess. The toilet is not just a piece of furniture. It is a monument to compromise, to innovation, to the constant, quiet effort to stay clean in a world that insists on getting dirty. It's our mirror not of what we aspire to be, but of what we truly are. And though the smell may change, be filtered, processed, or frozen in time, it will always be there, whispering through history, reminding us that underneath it all, we are creatures of flesh, function, and need. So the next time you sit, or squat, or hover, or wipe, remember the long road behind you, and the smell that never quite left.